Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Sankofa Video and Bookstore's virtual presentation. We have a wonderful event tonight that we've been preparing a great deal for, and we're so happy that you could join us. We're featuring tonight Dr.Ts'gye Rachel Titilayo Leslie, the author of The Children of Tawahedo, Africa, and the Ethio-Judeo Christian Legacy, published by Red Sea Press. And I'll give you a little bit background about Dr. Leslie, and I will also give you a background about two special interlocutors that we have with us this evening. The way that our show is designed is that Dr. Leslie will present her book, and the interlocutors at the end of that presentation will pose a question or a comment, two questions or comments each, and she will respond to both of those. And after that, we will open up the event for questions from the floor. So we're hoping to create a community atmosphere in a virtual environment. So I know that I miss very much the community environment that we were able to establish at Sankofa physically. And we hope to sort of represent that virtually as we stay safe in the process. So about Dr. Leslie. She is a Pan-African scholar born in Paris of Jamaican and Nigerian parents. She was educated in the US at Northwestern University and at Ludwig Maximillian University in Munich, Germany. She also studied at the University of Ile-Ife, now the Obafemi Awolowo University, under the guidance of Nobel Prize laureate Professor Wole Soyinka, and also the Ife priesthoods of Yoruba religion, and finally at Howard University, where she was awarded the Doctor of Ministry for her studies on the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church after studying with the support of the late patriarch, His Holiness Abuna Paulos, with the permission of the present patriarch, His Holiness Abuna Matthias. Dr. Leslie continues to pursue access to primary source materials on Nilotic African history through her current PhD studies in the Department of Semitic and Egyptian Languages and Literatures at the Catholic University of America, where she is the first woman of African descent to be admitted in the history of the institution. Dr. Leslie has dedicated her life to illuminating the contributions of Africans and the African descendants to global history and culture. And before, again, Dr. Leslie joins us, let me say something about our first special guest interlocutor, Professor Ephraim Isaac. Dr. Isaac is director and founder of the Institute for Semitic Studies in Princeton, New Jersey. Dr. Isaac is fluent in 15 languages, and he is an historic scholar who is well known internationally for his advocacy for peace all over the world. His latest book is the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, as well as Abram to Obama, A History of Jewish African and African American Relations. Both of these titles are published by Red Sea Press as well. Our second interlocutor is Mr. Fantahun Turune. Mr. Turune is the area specialist for Africa and the Middle Eastern Division, specifically for Ethiopian and Eritrean collections at the Library of Congress. As reference librarian and curator of Ethiopian rare materials, Mr. Turune has played an invaluable role in the development of the collection. He is editor and chief of the independent journal in Amharic called Seminawork, or Wax and Gold Journal. And he's also the author of The Ethiopian Students, Their Struggle to Articulate the Ethiopian Revolution. So before we get started again, just a couple more pieces of homework. Please make sure you stay muted until the questions are open to the floor. At the end of the interlocutors' questions and responses, please present your questions by chat. So the way that this will go is that your questions will be chatted, but we don't want the presenters to be distracted with a lot of questions or active chats while they're presenting. So please think about what you want to say and then stick it in the chat right after our last interlocutor. And let's see, I guess that's it. I think you should know that we are recording this event. That means that this event will appear on our Sankofa channel, which is featured on YouTube, with many other events of interest to you. And we hope to be building that collection as we go along. That's Sankofa channel on YouTube. So if you're not interested in being in the recording, please make that decision early so you can either appear or not appear. And by staying, you agree to appear. And I would like to get started now. I want to also remind you that we are featuring the first 100 sales with a 15% discount. The teaching of children of Tawahedo is 15% off for the first 100 people. And I think that we're also going to be offering, and we'll get a confirmation of this before we leave, several books signed by Dr. Leslie. Is that correct? And we don't know how many yet, but we hope to know how many before the program is over. And so with no further ado, we welcome Dr. Leslie.
Wow, Shirikiana, thank you for that very gracious introduction. And thank all of you for coming this evening. It's a lovely opportunity to speak with you. And, Shirikiana and I had a talk about, how we wanted to conceptualize this book launch. This is a first for me. And I think that I agree with her that it is a rare opportunity to sort of try and create community. So since I'm a new author, I think that I will tell you a little bit more about myself and sort of give you a little background on me and a sort of intellectual history, if you will, as well, before we get into how I came to write this book. And I'll do a reading for you as well from a couple excerpts of the book that I think are sort of very central. So, beginning with my family background, as Shirikiana mentioned, my late mother, who passed away last year, was the illustrious Professor Molara Wundigbe Leslie, who was a feminist theorist, a feminist theorist, and very famous poet in Africa. And she was also the first woman to write a first at University of London for English. And she went on to do a lot of work for women's rights in Africa, as well as to write a lot of inspirational poetry and do a sort of African critique of feminist theory. My father, Professor Joshua Leslie, is also a first. He's the first man of African descent to write his PhD for mathematics at the University of Paris at the Sorbonne. And both of them were very Afrocentric. So I was sort of born into sort of spoon-fed Pan-Africanism, as you will, if you will. I was born in Paris at a time when, my parents' friends were Chakanta Diop and Richard Wright and Langston Hughes, and this was sort of the ambiance into which I was born. And my parents then went on to play an instrumental role in the building of African universities in Nigeria. I spent my formative years, being raised by an African Yoruba woman, seeped in African culture, in the African worldview. And then much later on, my father would remarry an American woman. And so then I got exposed to African American culture and African American traditions. And this broadened my sort of Pan-African foundations. I then went on to became very interested in sort of reclaiming my African roots that I always felt most comfortable with, and pursued getting accepted into University of Ile-Ife, which is now Obafemi Awolowo University. And at the time when I decided to take my O-levels and go back to Nigeria to enter university, I was very lucky to have as my professor there, Professor Wole Soyinka, who had not yet won the Nobel Prize, the late Biodun Jaifo, who just passed away, sadly, a couple of weeks ago, who was at the Department of African Studies at Harvard, was also one of my professors, Dr. Dikbo Fashina, professor of African religion and philosophy, who is now in South Africa to the best of my knowledge. And this gave me the exposure to Ifa religion, because Ile-Ife is considered the holiest city in the religion of Ifa, the religion of West Africa. So I got my first sort of introduction to African religion actually through Ifa when I first started at university. Now, when I was at University of Ile-Ife, Babangida's coup of Nigeria, Babangida's coup d'etat led to the closing of my university, and I ended up applying to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, where at the time Professor Sterling Stuckey was still there, another professor who played a very formative role in the formation of my thought. He was a regular fixture of my childhood, and I heard his discussions about slave culture as he was writing that book and doing his research on it. So that aspect also had an impact on my thinking, and the sort of critique, the sort of historiographical critique that he gave. I grew up in that kind of ambiance and matured as an intellectual in that kind of ambiance. So now at Northwestern University, now I became a leader of Afrocentrism. I was elected as one of the leaders of FMO at Northwestern University. During that time, ended up inviting Minister Louis Farrakhan, Professor Angela Davis to come and speak with us. I was very much involved in that and majored in philosophy and German language and culture when I got to Northwestern University, and also had the rare opportunity to spend a lot of time arguing with the late Professor Jürgen Habermas, with whom I had very interesting arguments about intellectual history, and I used to critique him that he was very parochial, and he used to like to compliment me and tell me I was actually European. And I used to tell him that that was a very parochial way of thinking, that intellectualism was not confined to the European tradition. So, then when I was at Northwestern University, I continued in my historiographical critique in this sort of tradition of the way I've been raised to think. And I wrote an essay on National Socialism, or Nazism in Germany, where I said that my position was that Nazism in Germany and the Third Reich was really just an explosion of the colonial and racist ideologies that had been accepted within the European Academy, within European society, and they had more or less just exploded within the European context once Germany lost World War I and was no longer allowed to participate in what had, become accepted in Europe, in the West, as a colonial imperative, if you will, to spread European culture and around the world, and the concept of, European conquest and the sort of, the grand vision of people like Churchill, and so on, this general imperative, this sort of idea of the white man's burden. And I felt that my position in that paper was that when Germany was denied to express that imperative, Germany attempted to do it within the European context. And Germany and Northwestern University gave me a scholarship to study in Germany. So now I went to Germany, and I very much enjoyed the environment of the academy in Germany. I loved the academic rigor and the intellectual traditions of the German academy. And I went on to study there, and I ended up staying there for many years, had my first son, Haile Mikhail, and then had a sort of spiritual awakening after having been raised in an environment of socialism and scientific materialism, Pan-African, yes, but also socialist background. I went through a sort of spiritual awakening, which would later give me a lot of understanding for the so-called Mengistu generation in Ethiopia and a lot of their challenges, because I too came from this sort of socialist, Pan-African revolutionary background, and then went through a spiritual awakening in Germany that led me to Tawahedo Beit Christian in Munich, Germany, to a church called Bisrata Gabriel, which was led by a priest named Qessis Mesven Felike, who was an extremely, I had again the good fortune of having as my first priest a highly educated priest, Qessis Mesven Felike, who began teaching me the faith, began as a deacon under Atse Haile Selassie, under Emperor Haile Selassie at Selassie College, and was educated there, and then won a scholarship from the emperor to then go and study in Egypt. And he went to study in Egypt, and then he was a talented young priest in Egypt. He studied Coptic and Greek and Arabic, and then he was sent to Jerusalem, where he also served until finally, after Mengistu's revolution, when many Ethiopians were going to Europe, he was then called to Europe by Abuna Johannes and became one of the primary priests in Europe. So I met Qessis Mesven, explained to him the sort of spiritual awakening I was going through, and he advised that I speak with Abuna Johannes. Now, Abuna Johannes is very interesting because he was the first bishop for Europe, and Abuna Johannes was originally came to London because of the Jamaican community. Now, as you'll find in my book, I talk about the role that the Jamaican community has played in sort of rejuvenizing the missionary tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So originally the Jamaican community, together with the Ethiopians that were in London, wanted a priest, and then Abuna Johannes went to London and started Zion Mariam Church, where I would end up being baptized on the recommendation of Qessis Mesven Felike and Abuna Johannes. And this was almost 30 years ago. So I was then baptized in London, and Abuna Johannes, and I was with my son Haile Mikhail. I was separated from my husband, and I went with my son Haile Mikhail, and his name is Tristan, by the way. His birth name is Tristan. I'll talk about naming in a minute. And Abuna Johannes, when he baptized us, he gave me the name Ts'gye Mariam, which means the Rose of St. Mary. And he named my son Haile Mikhail, which means the power of the Archangel Michael. So then after that, I sold a lot of my assets. And before that, interestingly, I called my father and told him I was going to Ethiopia to study my new religion, Ethiopian Orthodoxy. My father, very surprised, said, "Do you have any idea that your brother has married an Ethiopian woman in Chicago?" And I said, "What?" So now I talked to my brother, and he asked me to go and meet his mother-in-law, who he had not yet met. So I went to Ethiopia. And there I met a woman who continues to be an inspiration to me and like a second mother to me, Yemesarach Demisi. And Yemesarach Demisi welcomed me into her family until today. And when I met with her, and it's interesting because God gave me another mother, very much like my mother. She's a very powerful figure, a feminist in Ethiopia who very much supported the cause of women, and also a very devout woman. And she welcomed me into her family and into her home until today. And she asked me what I was doing in Ethiopia. So I told her I wanted to go to the monastery to study Ethiopian Orthodoxy. And she said, oh my gosh. She was so shocked. And she said, how are you going to do that? You can't just go into a monastery. And I said, well, I'm going to ask the patriarch. So she said, do you know the patriarch? I said, no. So then I went to, I found out where the papal village is, if you like, in Addis Ababa. And I went there and went to the gate. And the guard asked me what I was doing there. And I said that I'd like to see the patriarch. And he said, who are you? And I told him who I was and where I was from. And then he said, he's very busy. And I said, no problem, I'll wait. So I waited at the gate for what must have been 3 hours until the guard came and said the patriarch would like to see who is this Jamaican woman standing at his gate for 3 hours. And this is how I met Abuna Paulos. So then I met Abuna Paulos, the late patriarch, and Abuna Gabriel was there, and the late Abuna Nathanael. And I met all of them, and they asked me what I wanted, and I explained to them that I wanted to study the faith, and that I wanted to live in the monastery. And Abuna Paulos laughed, and he said, have you seen our monasteries? Do you have any idea what you're talking about? And I said, no, but I would like to go and I would like to study. So Abuna Paulos now gave me a small house in a place, a holy place, where it is believed that a piece of the Holy Cross was before it went to Gishan Mariam. And this place is called Entoto Kidanamret. And it's an ancient church, actually. Many people don't realize it, but the Holy of Holies there goes all the way back to the Emperor Gebre Meskel. So now I went there, and priests were assigned to teach me, and I began to learn the theology, and I began to learn Amrinya. And from time to time, Abuna Paulos would send a car for me, and he gave me access to the library at Beteganet, which is the papal, sort of the papal village, and the equivalent of a papal village. Let me quickly explain. The Catholic Church, by its theology, has put the Pope over the Synod. In the history of Tawahedo Beta Christianis, you will see in my book, the Holy Spirit, or God, is considered the head of the Synod, and the Patriarch is under the Synod, and the Patriarch is considered the voice of the Synod to the people. So that, for example, in Tawahedo Beta Christian history and process, if you will, when the Synod wants to come to a decision, all of the bishops fast and pray, with the intention of receiving a decision from the Holy Spirit, which is then given to the people by the Patriarch. So the Patriarch is the equivalent of, something they have in Ethiopian culture called Afanagus, the mouth of the king, the person who speaks out the decision of the Synod, but there is no concept, as there was in the Catholic tradition, for example, as the infallibility of the Pope, or the Pope as, or the Patriarch as sort of the vicar of Christ on earth, or the representative of Christ. Our Patriarch is a representative of the Synod. So moving along, I went and I studied in the Betegnet Library, read a lot of the translations, because I could not yet read Ge'ez or Amharic. But there's quite an impressive translation, many of which were made as early as the 17th century by Jesuit Catholic priests who translated a lot of Tawahedo literature into English. So after that, I taught at Addis Ababa University for a year, and then finally, due to the unrest that happened during the time of Meles' second election, I left the country. I should mention I taught philosophy for about a year and a half at Addis Ababa University with Professor Samuel Asefa. Professor Andreas Achete, until the political unrest in the country led me to leave. Now I left Ethiopia and eventually then started studying with the priesthood here in the Washington, D.C. Area. Continued my studies, started studying Ge'ez, started interacting with the priesthood and some of the priests, including especially Mamher Zabene, Dr. Mamher Zabene, encouraged me very much to go back into the academy and to do an advanced degree. My original aim was to do a PhD in Africana Religious Studies at Howard. That didn't come to fruition, and so I did a DMin focusing on Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Christian history and theology. Theology and practice. And then when I got to the point of writing my dissertation, I petitioned my professors to allow me to return to Ethiopia in order to seek the guidance and have access to the theologians of Tawahedo Beta Christian. And my younger son also had decided he wanted to become a deacon. And so with the blessing of Abuna Phanuel, the bishop for the Diocese of Washington, D.C., I then returned to the Ethiopian monastery for the second time. This time again, I went to the door of the papal village, or the patriarch's village, and to my surprise, the same guard was there. He's very much older now, but the same guard was at the gate from the time of Abuna Paulos. So he said, Tamer, it's a miracle, it's a miracle. You've come back. Have you met the new patriarch? And I said, no. And so I met Abuna Matthias and got permission to return to the monastery a second time. Now, I went to the monastery and my son studied. I learned the Begina, which you heard when you were waiting to come in, which is, we call it the Harp of David. For many years, I had been listening to the Harp of David, so it was a dream come true for me to be able to learn it in the monastery. So I finished the DMin, and then I came back to the US and decided that I wanted to, I wrote the book and I decided that I wanted to get access to primary source materials. And then I started at Catholic University of America, my foci being classical Ethiopic and Egyptian, and also studying Attic Greek. So that is sort of that's my background in intellectual history. And now, before I talk a little bit more about the book, I would like to read to you the foreword, because I think that the foreword serves as a very good introduction to our discussion about the text. Because what the text really does is that, one of the things that was most amazing to me in my studies of Ethiopia Tawahedo Beta Christian was the ancient connection between Africa and the Judeo-Christian tradition. And to now come into Christianity and my study of Christianity from an African perspective was novel and paradigm shifting for me. And another thing that struck me, which I will talk about a little bit later, was the unique unity in the theology of the Ethiopia Tawahedo Beta Christian in its concept of one religion from Adam to Christ. So that in the European tradition, we always saw more of a division between the Judaic or the religion of the Hebrews and the religion of the Christians, Whereas what struck me about the Ethiopian Orthodox theology was this unity and continuity, the concept of one religion revealed by one God from Adam to Christ. And then also the Ethiopic or African origins of the Judeo-Christian tradition from the Ethiopian Tawahedo Beta Christian perspective, which we'll get into a little bit more in a bit. So let me read to you the foreword. So in 2017, while in the monastery in Ethiopia writing this book, after years of research, my initial aim was to write for Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church scholars and new believers. However, in the course of speaking with priests and deacons in the monastery, it evolved into a work of preserving the wisdom that I had been initiated into by many of the high priests mentioned in the acknowledgements. Initially, due to the diverse audience that I aimed to include, I strove to keep the language as accessible for as broad an audience as possible. There remain some theological terms, but with contemporary search engines available, that should be a surmountable and minor challenge. Moreover, many diverse parties interested in the history of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, both of African and European descent, impressed on me the value for both the academy and the church of my writing. I have long held that all history begins as oral history, and believe that we as African and African-descended scholars are well advised not to dismiss the oral histories that are imparted to us without examination. The conquest of Africa and the pillaging of African libraries and the burning and theft of books from the libraries of Timbuktu to the mountains of Ethiopia means that much of what was once written history in Africa likely now survives as oral history. Scientific research and examination based on oral histories is quite likely to unveil much of value and significance. We also hope to see more archaeological excavations in sub-Saharan Africa outside of lower Nilotic Africa, if you will, Egypt, and more recently Sudan. For example, biblical anthropology has led to fruitful archaeological finds in the Arab Peninsula and beyond. And I believe that further archaeological exploration based on oral tradition and remnants of what was biblical Kush in Nilotic Africa and or Upper Nile region, Congo, Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, and beyond into what is now Mali, Nigeria, Ghana, etc., will likely prove equally rewarding. It is hoped that Ethiopia will also allow more archaeological exploration in the future. The historical Ethiopian suspicion of Western archaeologists is understandable in view of the considerable distortions of the Western Academy during the colonial era concerning the role of Africa and those of African descent in global culture. In 1837, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, one of the most respected philosophers of Hegel of the modern age, stated that Africa had made no contribution to history. However, as younger and more diverse scholars enter the field, there should be less concern in Africa about the potential of historical and cultural distortions and theft of artifacts historically associated with international archaeological investigation in Africa. Moreover, particularly among younger archaeologists, there is an increasing concern with the provenance of artifacts and their preservation in the countries of their origin. Digital technology also presents many potential solutions for countries to record and track their artifacts on an international basis. This book is meant to present a perspective of the history of Judaism and Christianity seen through an ancient Ethiopian lens that is gradually blurring. The global reach of the Western seminary and academy and the admittedly waning though persistent control of information is eclipsing the old theology and worldview of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, both from within it and without. As more Ethiopian scholars and priests are gradually convinced of antiquated, racialized Western historical models and worldviews, there appears to me to be a sort of urgency to record these ancient perspectives. Moreover, even now, many remain unaware of the existence of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, its ancient history, and its insightful theological legacy. Uniquely insightful theological legacy. In the current climate of the United States, as demonstrations for racial equality and justice rage in the streets and demands for dignity are ubiquitous and resounding, it is clear to me that this book also underscores the contribution of Africans and those of African descent to global culture and thought that remains needed, especially in this moment. It is not enough that citizens of African descent are allowed dignity and a voice. A methodologically sound and scientifically accurate account of history, including the history of ideas, requires that the impact of African thought and traditions on global culture be elucidated. It is my hope that this book will simultaneously serve to illuminate the systematic marginalization of African contributions to world culture. Moreover, for all scholars, but particularly for those who are Christian and of color, it has been impressed on me that it is significant that it is made clear that the participation of Africans in the Christian story precedes both the Euro-American transatlantic slave trade from West Africa and the earlier trans-Indian ocean slave trade from East Africa. In speaking with Africans and those of African descent who encouraged me to publish this book, it was impressed on me the psychological import of being able to view African Christianity independently of the historical colonial aspirations of Europe and the Arab world. Finally, it was my intent to write another book entirely on the Nilotic, African, and/or Cushitic origins or influence on the Judeo-Christian priesthood and practice implied by the priesthood of Melchizedek, as understood from the Ethiopian Orthodox perspective, who is believed to be Ethiopian or Nilotic African in origin in the ancient Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition. I am presently working on a second tome now in the history of ideas for the Academy. To this end, I am completing a second doctoral degree in Semitic and Egyptian languages and literatures, a PhD that will allow me to access primary source materials and manuscripts to further underpin the teachings that I have studied with the priests of Ethiopia and the Babalawo priests of Ifa Yoruba spiritual traditions centered in Ile-Ife, Nigeria, and who are interestingly believed to have met the priests of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church in the 6th century. It is also noteworthy that amongst the Ijebus of Nigeria, it is believed that the Queen of Sheba of Ethiopia retired deep into her kingdom, heartbroken that her son Menelik chose to follow the Hebrew culture of his father. The Ijebus believe that she is buried in Yoruba land, and their kings bear a ritual title that sounds similar to Menelik. However, the romantic appeal of writing my first book for the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church that has adopted me was irresistible. I have been asked many times over the course of my 26 years or so as a member of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church and a student of the priesthood, both during my doctoral studies and since, how I find comfort among Ethiopians today because they no longer consider themselves Black or African. In fact, most of us are shades of red, sienna, red-brown, gold and blue, blue-brown like the striking Nilotic peoples. Any painter will tell you that to mix the color that most of us have, you will use primarily red, mixed with yellow and blue. We are truly red peoples. Allow me to respond further that the modern concept of Blackness, like whiteness, is a political construct defined by the modern struggle for justice in the West and in colonial Africa, for the most part. Although Ethiopians experienced enslavement from Arabs for centuries, e.g. Bilal al-Habashi, known in the Arab world as Muhammad's slave, and the first muezzin of Islam, or caller to prayer, was the child of Ethiopian slaves in Mecca. The transatlantic slave trade did not include Ethiopia directly. During the colonial era, because European armies failed in defeating the Ethiopian armies in battle, and due to the diplomatic savvy and statesmanship of Ethiopian administrators, the country remained isolated from much of the struggle for justice and freedom that took place in the rest of Africa and the colonies for the most of the history of colonialism. Moreover, when Emperor Menelik chose to modernize Ethiopia, he chose Westernization, with the support of England and the United States. Given the racist ideologies that dominated Western governance and international relations, Ethiopia pursued a sort of honorary white status to allow the transfer of technology. Furthermore, the racialized models of world history in the Western Academy posited Semites as people who transferred culture into Africa from outside of the continent in order to explain away African civilization. To comply with the Eurocentric racialized models of history accepted in the academy at the time. As such, Northern Ethiopians were posited as the descendants of Semites who were postulated to have originated from outside of Africa. These racialized models were introduced into the Ethiopian educational system by leaders who sought modernization, as Emperor Menelik did before them. In this manner, the pursuit of technological modernization from a Western world seeped in racism, including academic, racialized, historical, and linguistic models, led to the dispersion of these wrong-headed positions and beliefs into the general population. As these antiquated racialized models that were formed at the height of the colonial era have been scientifically examined more carefully, alternative models are being established in the Western Academy, the knowledge of which has not yet reached the masses of Ethiopians. Many scholars now hold, particularly in Europe, that the origin of Semites appears to actually be Ethiopia, as was once taught in the Ethiopian Tawahedo Beta Christian. This suggests that the original Semites may likely have been Africans who in fact transferred Nilotic African culture into the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the world.
Wow.
So now I would like to talk a little bit. I had taken some notes and I wanted to talk a little bit about, excuse me 1 minute. I wanted to talk a little bit about the conquest of the world that was engendered by, that sort of began with, and I talk about this in the book, the discovery of the New World and the concept of the Western European that began to develop with the contest against the Ottoman Empire and the desire to find trade routes that would culminate in the discovery of the New World and the conquest of Africa. And to understand the importance of bringing the theology and history of Ethiopia Tawahedo Beta Christian to the fore and why so little is known about it. So one of the aspects of global conquest is the delegitimization of the institutions of other peoples. So what the Eurocentric historiographical models have done are to delegitimize institutions from other parts of the world so that people don't know that Christianity and Judaism even existed in Ethiopia from their onset. people don't know that biblical Cush, when you go to Genesis and they talk about Adam being in a place where there was a river that went through all of the land of Cush, they don't realize that this Cush that's being referred to are the kingdoms south of Egypt. And that how the Egyptians referred to the kingdoms that were south of Egypt were as Cush. So that they do not realize that Africa is present and Ethiopia is present from Genesis in the Judeo-Christian story. So one of the things that I found, as I said before, so compelling about Ethiopia Tawahedo Beta Christian is that Ethiopia Tawahedo Beta Christian takes the position that from Genesis until the New Testament, it is one religion, and it is one religion in which Ethiopia has played a central role from Adam until Christ. Now, when you go to study, usually when you go to study about Ethiopia Tawahedo Beta Christian, in line with these sort of Eurocentric models that I'm talking about, they will tell you that Christianity was brought into Ethiopia in the fourth century by Assyrian. Now, for example, what we know when we look at it from the Ethiopian perspective and the evidence that we're seeing now is that Christianity was present in Ethiopia before that, before King Ezana. And so one of the chapters that you'll see in the book is referring to the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch, which is, if we have time, I wanted to read a small excerpt from the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch. Because whether one, as I talk about the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch, whether one believes the story, whether one is Christian or not Christian, what it shows is that in the milieu of the first century, Ethiopia was present. Ethiopia was a present and known entity to the audience of St. Luke. So that, you know, let me just read a little bit from here. So, the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch. One of the biblical accounts, the study of which demonstrates the impact of history on hermeneutics and historical analysis, is the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch. Here we will examine how Eurocentric and sometimes racist historical analyses and philosophies have impacted the interpretation of this account to better understand how the role of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church and Ethiopia Africa have been historically diminished in the global Christian conversation, self-understanding, and history of the faith. Because an Ethiopian African is the central figure of the account, it makes Ethiopia central to the story and the study of the early church, or it certainly should. Because the African Ethiopian is described in the account in the Acts of the Apostles as a devout African, returning from worshiping in Jerusalem to an African royal court, and so presumably, according to the logic of the account, a man literate in Hebrew, as well as his own language, a cultured man of the ancient world, because for generations, in the context of the denigration of Africans in the place of Africa in the world, which we will discuss below, his existence has been a conundrum. The account of the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch has had a meaningful impact on scholars, historians, artists, the laity, and clerics in the West and beyond for millennia. That the account of St. Luke the Apostle was included in the early Christian scriptures bespeaks the significance of Ethiopians and or the people of Africa in the milieu of the early church. An account can have little impact if the audience that one is addressing has no concept of what is being indicated or denoted. Presumably, the audience of the apostle had some concept of the key characters motifs, and/or context of the story, or it likely would not have been included in such essential scripture for the early church, given their political aims. It would seem probable that the audience of Acts then knew of Ethiopia, what a eunuch was, and that there were powerful African queens. It is also interesting that the name of the queen, Candace, in the narration, so closely fits the actual title of Ethiopian queens of the Nubian kingdoms in use in the Nile Valley at the time. Indeed, Kandake Aminishaketo defeated the Romans in battle when they attempted to annex her land to Rome in 27 to 22 BC. Moreover, although Nubia and Meroe were declining in power, Kandake Aminatore, who reigned in the first century, was well known in Rome as well. This historical fact shows that there were not only a knowledge of the Kandakes, contemporaneous with the period in which Luke, the apostle, related this incident, but that there was interaction between them and the Mediterranean, so that it is not unlikely that the apostle's account was of great impact and import to his audience. Moreover, it should be underscored that as cognitive beings, we experience the world through the sieve of our concepts and beliefs. So the fact that many believe the account has impacted history and the world in which we live, regardless of whether or not the narration has been scientifically proven. Moreover, that it was included in such foundational scripture of the early church has meant that societies that incorporated the Bible into their political and religious life and institutions, or used the Bible as the basis for their public institutions, as is the case with Europe and the New World, were likely forced to reconcile the biblical advent of this presumed pious and astute African to their ethics, social organization, and theologies. For this reason alone, given the broad impact of scripture on global culture, and particularly the Acts of the Apostles until today, St. Luke's account of the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch and its impact remains a narration of historical and contemporary political, theological, and philosophical import. As Ethiopian Orthodox theologians and teachers in the West, particularly as we minister unto those of African descent and others educated in the Western context, the impact of this account is useful and meaningful. The Acts of the Apostles marks the beginning of the missionary efforts of the apostles to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. And the Ethiopian eunuch is one of the first to be baptized into the faith. The first chapter of Acts states that the intent of the apostles is to spread the gospel to all Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. So their mission began among the people who inhabited and traveled through the region. If we look at the list of peoples named on the day of Pentecost, then we see that these people were Africans and Middle Easterners of various nations, with the majority being Jews and Samaritans. It is particularly telling that it is written that the Ethiopian eunuch is on his way back from worshiping in Jerusalem and is reading the book of Isaiah. From this alone, we can deduce that Jerusalem was posited as a place for worshiping God in the view of the Ethiopian, and that he was held to be a student of scripture. He cannot properly be characterized as a Gentile, and certainly not an idolater, like the Greeks and Romans of the time, nor was he a heathen or a pagan, like the Germanic, Nordic, and Celtic peoples of the era. So this account would have given the early Christians the impression that Ethiopians or Africans were not idolaters or pagans, but rather a pious, monotheistic people. This would imply that St. Luke the Apostle had a high regard for Ethiopians. The account of the eunuch reading the book of Isaiah on his way back from worshiping in Jerusalem strongly suggests that he was a worshiper of the God of the Old Testament scriptures, which seems to indicate that he was a Cushite Jew. Cush here meaning the kingdoms south of Egypt, including Ethiopia, if not certainly a devout African of the first century who believed in the God worshipped in Jerusalem, a God of Old Testament scripture. In the Western Protestant theological discourse, there has been much doubt been much doubt accrued to the veracity of the account due to the fact that eunuchs were allegedly not allowed to worship throughout Jerusalem based on a law in the Old Testament. However, it is important to note that the Judaic temple was divided into sections, like the Ethiopian Beit Negus, with one area reserved for the unclean and even for non-Jews to worship. The Chamber of Women was a section of the northwest side of the temple where women, healed lepers, and foreigners could congregate. Moreover, and even more importantly, the book of Isaiah clearly states that eunuchs and foreigners who worship the Lord will be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, seemingly as an addendum to the basic law stated in Deuteronomy, or perhaps as an indication of an evolution in the understanding and practice of the faith by the Hebrews. Considering that most eunuchs of the time were practicing belief systems that conflicted with that of the Hebrews, the scripture forbidding eunuchs from entering the congregation of God's people was likely meant for eunuchs of other belief systems, which were myriad in the region at the time. Interestingly, the Ethiopian is a foreign eunuch who believes in the God of Israel, and so would fit the exact criteria given by Isaiah for those who indeed could be admitted to the temple to worship in Jerusalem. Finally, it is noteworthy that seemingly even before the sun has set on the day that they have met, once the eunuch is told of the good news by the apostle, he swiftly requests baptism without hesitation. If so, then he was taught and baptized within a very short time. I'm going to skip forward a little bit here.
And just as a reminder, Dr. Leslie will be bringing in Dr. Isaac in about 2 minutes.
Oh, thank you. So in general, let me wrap up by saying that what the book is trying to present is an alternative perspective on the history of Judaism and Christianity as we know it. And as you go through the book, you will see that I come from an Ethiopian Orthodox perspective, that Christianity was present in Ethiopia long before the first century, and that Ethiopia has played a central role to the Judeo-Christian tradition from the onset of Judaism throughout the history and on throughout the history of Christianity.
Thank you very much. And I am very anxious to hear from the audience. You bring so much very important material to the fore. And Dr. Isaac, would you like to pose your first comment or question?
Okay, well, first of all, let me say I was originally going to come and pose questions and make comments. Unfortunately, last night, some crisis had happened in our country, and I did not sleep at all. So in fact, I'm only here, as I told Dr. Ts'gye Rachel.
He has to unmute.
Have you heard? I'm unmuting. But
okay, perfect.
Somebody mutes me back. So as I said, first of all, I start with an apology that I will not be able to stay with you more than about 10 minutes because of the critical situation in our beautiful homeland. But however, I would like to say it has been a great pleasure to have met Dr. Ts'gye Rachel Titilayo, and I've been very, very impressed with her dedication and commitment to the study of Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Tewahedo Church, and more importantly, she's not only studied, she's really committed. She's become a member of the church and very dedicated. She is a good missionary for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and her understanding and her love and understanding of the Ethiopian church really has impressed me. I was very impressed, in fact, with her her chanting ፍካሬ ዘጻድቃን ወጸኃጥኣን መዝሙራት ዘዳዊት ሃሌሉያ ብዙ ብእሲ ዘይሆረ ቆሞ ዘተፈኖታትያን she could recite that. Could you recite that for everybody?
Yes, I think that's a good idea, Professor, because many people have never heard Ge'ez. And Ge'ez is a very ancient language. It's the liturgical language of our church. I will recite, I'm on 120 now, which is Psalm 120. I lift my eyes unto the mountains. It's Ansaiku Iantia Mengaladbar Im Aite Yumta Radiatia Radiatia Sem Haba Xavier Zagebra Samai Wamitra Ihubon who Catalagaria Yadekes Yakabaka. Now who Iadekes what Ianawoms Akabol Israel. Xavier Kabka, Xavier Kadinka, Bayamane de who, Maalta Tsahai Iawika, what I wara balelit, Xavier Kabka, Kului, with Mahatsan Alan of Suka Xavier Kabka, Vanagda Tuka, over Uta Tuka, Imya Ize, was Gula Alam, Sabahatala Ab, Wawad, Umfas Kadus, Lalam, Lalam Alam, Amen.
Okay, very impressive that she's memorized some psalms in the Ge'ez language.
And can you put your video on, please, Dr. Isaac?
I put it disappears by itself.
Your sound is great, but your picture's not there. Your video's off.
Well, I don't know why it goes off, but
There, now we can see.
All right.
Gotcha.
Well, as I said, I'm very impressed with her knowledge of the study of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. In particular, also, she, I guess, is a modern-day advocate of the Pan-African role and the centrality of Ethiopia in Pan-Africanism. So maybe I can, well, there are two aspects about which I could ask her, and maybe she could elaborate upon. One is the place of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in that Pan-African movement, and secondly, her study of the relationship between the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox Church and Judaism, which she rightly describes, and we all have worked on this subject of the relationship or the centrality of both Judaism and Jewish literature in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Maybe she can comment on that, and after that I will just greet her and run away.
I'll start with the last question first. I think that in my studies in Ethiopia, beginning with Abuna Paulos up until today, what continues to strike me is the logic of the systematic theology of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and how it unites Judaism with Christianity, and really has really taken a literal sort of approach to Christ's words that he's not come to change the law, but to fulfill the law. So that we find that Ethiopian Orthodox theologians have striven from the beginning to see to it that the form of Christianity that developed in Ethiopia is in harmony with the Judaic tradition. So that you see a continuity in an understanding of this Christian idea, for example, that, Christ is the second Adam. One of the things I think that best demonstrates this unity is looking at Mosaic law. So that, for example, in Mosaic law, it is said that there is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church does not say that that law no longer holds. What the Ethiopian Orthodox Church said is that indeed, as it's the same God, it's one God who speaks one truth. And as God said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, so there must be recompense for sin. That every sin, that the meaning of that is that every sin requires recompense. And indeed, that recompense is blood. Now, how is it blood? From the Christian perspective, the Ethiopian Orthodox perspective, Christ is the second Adam and is divine. So I didn't get a chance to talk about the title of the book, but we talked about Tawahedo. What does Tawahedo mean? Tawahedo comes from the Ge'ez word wahad, and wahad means to unite. So Tawahedo is the passive form of the Ge'ez word. It means that which has been united. So what Tawahedo Beta Christian is saying, what Christ represents is the unity of the Adamic form, the human Adamic form with the divine God. So that now the self-sacrifice of God, which is the crucifixion of Christ, becomes an eternal recompense for sin. So that the blood of Christ is always in Moses' balance. So that where Moses said there must be an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, on the one side is the sin, and from the Tawahedo Beta Christian perspective, on the other side is the eternal recompense of Christ, a divine being who has sacrificed himself so that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is a true law. So, and we see this sort of continuity, we see this sort of systematic logic that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church strives to maintain between the Judaic and the Christian traditions. We see it also in the Sabbaths, in the fact that Ethiopia Tawahedo Beta Christian recognizes both Saturday and Sunday consciously, yeah? Everybody in the world represents both Sabbaths. I mean, respects both Sabbaths, but they don't know it. They just call it the weekend, right? But, but the weekend is made up of both the Sabbath, the Shabbat, and the Sabbath of the resurrection. So there are many ways in which the Tawahedo Beta Christian maintains that unity and respects the Judaic tradition.
Well, my second question, before I go, was again your contribution to the discussion about the Pan-African, the importance of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in the movement of Pan-Africanism. Indeed, a lot of the liberation movements in Africa, like the churches in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria, like the Al-Dugura, and many of the independents, like the Kimbanguist, they always looked to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as for liberation. And you are bringing that. You're also showing the bridge that exists. Can you say something about that? And then after that, I'll say my greetings to you.
Yes, Kashe. You know, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is an African church. It is not, according to the history of the theologians of Ethiopian Orthodox Church, we are not the descendants of the Hebrews. The Hebrews are the descendants of Ethiopians. So that you have the belief that the first priesthood, the priesthood of Melchizedek, because Abraham, when you look at the Hebrew Bible, Abraham is told to leave his people in Mesopotamia, and he's told to go and the people will be added unto him. And he goes down into Egypt and people are added unto him. And then he goes into Canaan. And when he's in Canaan, and you see in the table of nations that Canaan is one of the brothers of Cush. So he goes into Canaan, and there in Canaan, God says to him that he should pay an asarat, a 10th portion of his harvest, to his priest. So this is why I call this the Ethio-Judeo Christian tradition. I believe it should be called such because before Abraham, there was a priest of God, and his name was Melchizedek. So now the question is, who is this original priest, this Melchizedek? Well, Tawahedo Beta Christian is of the position that Melchizedek is a priest in Canaan, who is of Ethiopian origin. Okay, so not only that, there is, as you'll see in the book, there is the position that the Chaldeans of Ur, which are the ethnic group of Abraham, originated from Cush. Now, Cush, again, being the kingdom south of Egypt. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved all of this knowledge, all of this ancient knowledge on the African origins of priesthood. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church also talks about, for example, I'm right now translating in Ge'ez 2 Kings. And one of the interesting things in 2 Kings is that King Sennacherib of Assyria rises up to fight against Israel. And it says in one sentence that there is a king named Tarik of Cush, who rises up of Ethiopia. In some versions of the Bible, it's Ethiopia. He rises up and he fights against the Assyrians and liberates Jerusalem. So there is an ancient relationship between Ethiopia and Jerusalem that goes all the way back to the Old Testament, the knowledge of which is preserved within Tawahedo Beit Christian. Interestingly, King Ezana wanted to wage a war all the way to Jerusalem based on that history in 2 Kings in the Old Testament of King Taharka, the Ethiopian. So for Africans looking for a connection to the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church opens a door that is theirs, that is not through colonial powers, but that shows Africans and those of African descent how they are central to the Judeo-Christian story.
Well, thank you so very, very much. I wish I could stay with you. If the situation is not what it is, I would have enjoyed hearing you. I'm really very, very impressed with your commitment to the study of this Ethiopian tradition and your knowledge of the Giz language. I'm sorry, I would like to hear you playing the bagana another time, because I know you stay the bagana. You're a very good missionary for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and I would introduce you to some other people eventually. Really, I compliment you for such commitment and such dedication, and you're a very bright person also. You have really deep understanding of some of the issues, and I congratulate you on your book, which I hope that many people will be interested in buying, Teaching of the Children of Tawahedo, Africa and Ethio-Judeo Christian Legacy. It's a wonderful book. I enjoyed reading it. I wish I could stay with you, but you know.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ephraim Isaac.
Thank you very much.
Very, very much. I'm sorry.
Blessings.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gashe, and thank you for all of your efforts on behalf of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa and Africa now. And may God bless the works of your hands and the path of your feet and everything you're doing.
Thank you very much. Tabarki.
Amen.
And so thank you so much again. And we will now go to our next interlocutor as Dr. Isaac goes on to his other very, very important work. Our next interlocutor is Fantahun Torone, and I've introduced him earlier. In the interest of time, I'm going to hope that all of you heard that introduction, and we're very happy to have Atu Torone with us now. And let's,
okay.
We'll only be having his audio, unfortunately.
Good evening, everyone. First, I want to thank Sankofa Video and Bookstore and the Red Sea Publishers for making this event possible. I feel immensely honored to be on the same platform with my favorite person, Dr. Ephraim Isaac, whom I invited in 2014 to give a presentation at the Library of Congress at the African and Middle Eastern Division Forum, based on his new book on the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. The video recorded has become popular worldwide. To the author, Dr. Rachel Leslie, I want to congratulate you openly for your success in publishing your first book. You and I have discussed about your plan to write this book many, many years ago. And I did encourage you to go ahead, but I never thought it would come out as beautifully as it did. And of course, certain things, I think, what I thought would be the content of the book has substantially changed. Or on my side, it was probably a misunderstanding because we see each other once in every long while and so on and so forth. But you've been making many strides and progress and adding more knowledge after knowledge. As I see you, you're wonderful. I personally am familiar with the Tawahedo Church and its practices. I'm a follower of the Catholic faith, but I have a strong DNA connection with the Tawahedo practices through my mother, who was a devout believer of the faith. I was trained by her to seriously fast the Tawahedo fasting seasons, the prayers, besides what I was catechized at the Catholic Church. So I am sort of a hybrid between the two religions, and I draw great lessons from both. Additionally, at the Library of Congress, where I work at, I have a first-hand access to so many resources and books on the Tawahedo Church. From a librarian's point of view, I consider this book that we're talking about as resourceful. It would be a useful resource for the study of the Tawahedo Church. If it expands on the index, I think we've talked about that with Rahel, and make some adjustments. I was debating with myself if this book was really meant only to the children of the Tawahedo faith. In actual fact, this book has several new information about the Tawahedo Church that can inform other religious sects and denominations. Generally speaking, the salient points in the book focus on the beauty and integrity of the Tawahedo Church, its historical and spiritual legacies, its role as a repository of the Ethiopian and African ethereal and worldly knowledge, its role as a soul of Ethiopian spirituality, and potentially as one that will emerge as a ground that will prepare the new Jerusalem, heralding the second coming of Jesus the Christ, I believe. But in the interest of time, I will just proceed with the questions I have for Dr. Rahel. But from your introductions, I think you have.
That's Kareema's wife, and that's the lady that wrote the book. But
you have answered many of the potential questions I was going to ask, and this one being one of them. But I want you to delve a little deeper, because I believe your theological studies have been the basis of your original script of your doctoral dissertation, and hence the basis for this book. In your book, you have indicated in several instances the subject of systematic theology. Could you elaborate on what systematic theology is, and also indicate if the Ethiopian Tawahedo faith has a brand of its own?
You said you had a few questions. Do you want me to answer them one after the other? Or?
Yes, I think.
Okay. Yes, systematic theology is a system of theology through which there is a systematic treatment of the core concepts of the religion in such a way that in terms of an ordering of the doctrine, in such a way that one can make certain truth statements in terms of logical tables, that one can make certain consistent logical statements in a coherent and rational way about the theological systems which comprise the faith. and which explain the relationship between the faith. Hello, or am I still, can you still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, that explain the relationship between the faith and human experience. Okay, and also in a cognitive framework and understanding that is rational, right? So with the Ethiopia Tawahedo Christian, we do have a systematic theology. There is a tradition of systematic theology and rational argumentation within the church. This is different from, it's different from having a scientific materialist approach to religion. If you will, a scientific, systematic theology is trying to create a philosophical cogency in the concepts and ideas that make up the religion. And Tawahedo Beta Christian certainly has that, and it's taught within the seminaries. For example, the example that I gave Professor Isaac of the continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament in terms of understanding the law. Okay, so what you will see within, you'll see this kind of thing quite often in Ethiopia Tawahedo Beta Christian theological tradition, where there is an attempt to rationalize Judaic theological thought in the Christian context in that way. How is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? How is the concept of the recompense of sin? How does that fit within a Christian context where we're asked to forgive, right? How can that make sense? And the way it's made sense is to say, well, there's a divine being who is now the eternal recompense. And so through faith in that divine being, that eternal sacrifice is eternally in the balance for sin for the believer. So this now creates a rational framework in which Judaism and Christianity can exist together.
Rahel, could Andimsa be part of this systematic theology?
Absolutely.
I'd just like to interject here that we've got about 4 minutes before we open it up to broader questions, just as a keeping clock here.
I only have 4 minutes.
Uh-huh.
You can extend that a little bit, Shirikiana. I think
It's actually, okay, it's just a time clock check. If you want to extend it, it's your program. Go right ahead.
Thank you, because I think this is an important point on the systematic theology. And yes, the Adimta are an essential part of the systematic theology. And there's also a very interesting tradition within Tawahedo Beta Christian that fits within the systematic theology, and that is some of the earliest church fathers from the time of like Abba Salama, like the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. They went back to the Old Testament and identified every time the Holy Spirit is referred to, every time Saint Mary is referred to. They will go back into the book of Isaiah and say that gate that is entered without opening, that's the Virgin Mary. And they'll go back, when you look at Arganon, and they go back into Old Testament scripture, and they identify in Old Testament scripture very systematically every time where you can find the Holy Spirit, every time when you can find prophecy about Saint Mary, and so on and so forth. These are all the foundations for Ethiopian Orthodox systematic theology.
Thank you. I will go to the next one. Regarding decolonizing the African hearts and minds from Western biases and destructive practices, considering the wealth of knowledge, accumulation of the Tawahedo Church and its elaborate practices throughout the centuries, what role can the Ethiopian Tawahedo Church play in re-educating its people and in educating even the West?
Yeah, I think that, it brings to mind something that Abuna Paulos said to me. when I was leaving Ethiopia, he was like, oh, phew, you didn't cause any scandals or anything in the Gadam, and nobody had anything bad to say about you, thank goodness. And then he sort of very seriously said, you've really opened up the synod and opened up in the eyes and the minds of the synod the idea that the church can be open to the world. And that people who have been educated in the West, who've been educated in Western tradition, can become a part of our church, and that we need to open up. I think that it is extremely important for Africans and people of African descent, but also for Europeans, because, in general, what Eurocentric models of history have done is given the entire world a very skewed view of human history, and has left out the contributions of large parts of the world to global history and culture. Ethiopia has made a significant contribution to global history and culture that needs to be elucidated, and from which all of us will benefit. Let me quickly say about the Abuna Gerima manuscripts, which are the manuscripts of the Aksamite Bible. Until recently, nobody knew that Ethiopian Tawahedo Christian translated the Bible directly from Attic Greek into Ge'ez. The position had always been that it had been translated, that the Ethiopian Bible had been translated from Coptic into Ge'ez or Syriac into Ge'ez. But now we have had the Abuna Gerima manuscripts redated. They date back to between the 4th and the 6th centuries. That means that Ethiopians were translating the Bible into Ge'ez at a time where much of the Western world had no experience of the Bible. And so Ethiopia played an essential role in the understanding of Scripture. There was a fluency, and that means that there were a class of priests in Ethiopia that must have had a mastery of Attic Greek. It changes the entire world. It changes how we understand the world and the role of Africa in it. And Tawahedo Christian has been preserving all of this knowledge for all of this time. When I would discover these things, I would go to the bishops, I'd be reading, and I would go to the bishops and I would say, but look at this, do you know this? And they said, no, we know this. I said, but why are you not sharing this with the world? I'm like, what do you mean Melchizedek is an African? And then they said, yeah, he's an African, now we know. Yeah, he's African. And they just go on about their business. But these things are extremely important for all people of African descent to know, and for people in the entire world to know. I mean, I think that all scholars, people who are truly, interested in the truth, regardless of descent or race, those of us who are scholars who are really on this journey of finding the truth have a lot to learn from Ethiopia Tawahedo Christian. A lot.
Thank you. I'm going to borrow Dr. Ephraim's time because he spoke little. So the third question is, why is the book of Eunuch taken as an apocryphal reading by Western churches, while the Ethiopian Tewahedo Church has included it among the 81 books of the Bible?
Well, I think that one of the things that, one needs to keep in mind, as the Ethiopian Orthodox fathers say, is that there was no real Hebrew tradition amongst Europeans. They went from paganism into Christianity. Most Europeans went from, worshiping Thor, the thunder god, or, some of these pagan European gods. I cannot, remember all of them, or, Zeus, or, they went from paganism straight into Christianity. That is, their introduction to Christianity comes after the Septuagint, right? So they're coming after the Septuagint directly into Christianity. Whereas in Ethiopia, as you see from, stories like the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch, or as you see from, there's also archaeological evidence now that demonstrates a lot of this. There was a Judaic presence in Ethiopia. There was a monotheistic presence in Ethiopia before the Christian era. So that you had a survival within Ethiopia of Judaic texts that were never extant in Europe. They never existed in Europe. So Europeans were completely dependent upon the Septuagint in order to receive Judeo-Christian scripture. Whereas in Ethiopia, you had this constant relationship through the port of Adulis into the Red Sea. I mean, there's almost no time where we can go where there was not a relationship between the Middle East and Ethiopia. And so you had Judaic peoples moving back and forth. And you also had texts moving back and forth, much earlier than what was extant in much of Europe.
Thank you so much. I would have loved to invite you to give a talk at the African and Middle Eastern Forum if my boss, Dr. Kitchener, Lisa Kitchener, is listening. I'm sorry, Lanisa Kitchener is hearing. Maybe she and I will talk about that, and hopefully you agree. I'll stop right here.
Thank you very much. Gosh,
we do hope that she will appear at the Library of Congress and many other places so that more of us can legitimize, I think, what many of us have been saying for a long time. And the scholarship is right in front of us, the origins of Christianity being in Africa. And thank you so much for helping us to understand this really, really, really well and your continued research. I'd like people who have questions now to go ahead and enter them in chat. Dr. Rahel will be looking at the chat questions. You can send them to everyone. I think that's perfectly allowable and might be the quickest way. And let's see, Dr. Leslie, are you able to see the questions on chat and begin answering at your leisure?
I'm seeing some amazing comments. I'm very impressed with the audience. To be quite honest, this is quite an impressive audience. Yeah, any of those, I will leave that to you, Shirikiana. Any question, anybody that you would, that you see there that you think is interesting?
We have some thanks from Lanisa Kitchener to everyone. Thank you so much for you thanking us, appreciating us. A quick comment about how archaeological evidence in Ethiopia, Aksum region, recently unearthed a basilica church built in the early 300s, showing that a more mature faith was there before the 400s. That's from Meron Ababa.
Yes, Meron Ababa is a very close friend of mine. And we know each other from church. And she's also very well read on the faith.
So I'll move on so you can let me know when you want to comment, you just go ahead. And I hope that the audience will not feel shy to go ahead and post your questions or comments. We have about 40 in attendance, and we love to see and hear from you.
Jana, there is a question at the beginning. Gabriel Daniel, I see the name Gabriel Daniel.
Yeah, maybe unmute him so he can speak. Michaela?
Michaela can do that.
Ato Gabriel Daniel?
I can read this until he comes on. He says, does your book go into the story of Queen of Sheba, King Solomon, and Menelik? I heard when I was in Nigeria about the burial site of Queen Sheba and the days observed annually. Did I hear that right? How about the name Ejebu? Do you think it may be related to Ababu? People who accompanied Sheba.
Yes.
Might be a wild association.
I wish that I could see. Is it possible to highlight Ato Gabriel, Michaela, so that I can see him?
I think she's looking for him now. I don't know if he's still on.
I see him.
I'm there.
Okay.
Gosh, and Dominerso.
Dana and Dominish.
Exactly, Maskan. Danane.
But I'm less than Nick now.
Oh, exactly, still. But I mean,
But I'm the Silan.
that's
Yeah, I was in Nigeria. I used to work in Nigeria, and one of the things that I heard was about the burial place of Cunhiba. And I was amazed about it. I have also really known about other connections of Nigeria to Ethiopia. And when I asked a professor actually who told me about it, he told me that the burial place was there and they observe her anniversary every year, and that a lot of people come there. And I asked them, okay, if she was a Nigerian, he basically recounted the story of the Bible. And I asked him, but did she have a son? And he said, yeah. And I said, where is the son? Then he told me that the queen sent him to Ethiopia to be the king. So the connection, interesting connection. So I don't.
Because that's interesting, because I heard it differently, and this is why, oral history is something that, one has to be careful with it, because, different people tell different stories for different intentions, but I think that there's always a grain of truth somewhere in there. That's my attitude with oral history. There's some grains of truth somewhere. So what was interesting to me when I first heard this story, the way I heard it was that she was buried there. Okay, I discovered first that she was buried there before going to the place. And I read about, not that she was buried there, rather that the Ijebus believed she was buried there, to put it properly. So I read about that the Ijebus believed she was buried there. And then I read that the place where they believed she was buried had been declared by the British Library to be one of the wonders of the earth, because more soil had been moved to build the roads and underground tunnels than to build the pyramid at Giza. So it's an amazing sort of work. And then so I was studying with Nabura-id Ermias, the Nabura-id of Aksamite at the time. So I said, when I discovered it, so I said to Nabura-id, I was like, Amatachin, good slow. And he said, it's interesting. He said, you should check it out if you can, because in Aksum, they have a history that the Queen of Sheba, when her son decided to follow the Hebrew culture of his father, that she was heartbroken and she retired deep into her kingdom. Now, Ethiopia, as I talk about in the book, Ethiopia is understood as an empire in ancient times, okay? All the way up into Haile Selassie, right? Because you have the concept of Negusa Nagast, right? So the concept of Negusa Nagast is what? That there is a king of kings, which means there are many kingdoms. Okay, so you have the Aksamite kingdom, you have the Gondar kingdom, you have the Konso kingdom, you have all of these kingdoms, and then there's a Negusa Nagast who's over all of these kingdoms, who's an emperor. Now, this concept is a concept that we see in the Nile Valley for, ancient. It's ancient. To the beginning of the kingdoms, you have collections of kingdoms that are referred to by various names. So that Ethiopia itself is, throughout the ancient world, seems to have been a name that was given to, at times, all of the known kingdoms of Africa. So from the Greek perspective, at times the Greeks would refer to all of the kingdoms that they knew of in Africa as Ethiopia. So there are many kingdoms. That's what I want to say first of all. Now, the church has the position that Negista Saba, Saba in Ge'ez means queen of the people. Sab is person. Saba is plural, people. So to me, it seems like a title more than the name of one person. Queen of the people sounds to me like Negusa Nagast. It seems like a title that may have been used for queens in general at the time. Okay, so now you have an empress who is presumably an empress of many kingdoms. Now, how far do these kingdoms reach at any given time? We don't know. This has to be a subject of archaeological endeavor. Now, we do know that at one time, the Ethiopian nexus of kingdoms, if you will, included Nubia, included Meroe, included many kingdoms in Africa were included within the Ethiopian nexus of kingdoms. So it is conceivable that, as the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has said, they said, that there was no end to the kingdom of Saba, right? Now, this has a theological meaning, but it also, from the perspective when I talk to the bishops, they say all of Africa, Ethiopia, na perchinji. So there's the idea that Ethiopia once encompassed all of the African kingdoms. So in this worldview, if we see Africa, if we understand Ethiopia as a nexus of African kingdoms, it's conceivable that this nexus could have stretched into West Africa. So if this nexus of Ethiopian kingdoms did stretch into West Africa, then it's conceivable that when the Aksamites say, heartbroken that her son decided to follow the culture of the Hebrews, she retired deep into her kingdom, it's conceivable that she may have died in Nigeria. Nobody knows where she's buried. We know that the seat of her government, or it is believed within the church that the seat of her government was in Aksum. Nobody knows where her burial place is. Now, what's interesting to me is that when I went to bury my mother, who is an Ijebu, when I went to bury my mother in Ijebu, my mother, she wanted to convert to Tawahedo, but we couldn't find a Tawahedo priest, so she converted to Catholicism. And the Catholic priest who came was an Ijebu priest, and he came, and I asked him, I said, have you heard of this thing that, the Queen of Sheba is supposed to be buried in Ijebu? And he said, that's my village. And I said, what? He goes, I can take you there, like in a few days. So we went there together. And what was so interesting to me, I took my begana, by the way, I played my begana there. And then, so we went there. And what was so interesting to me, when we got to the gate of the place, he told me the story that he heard as a child. Everyone is terrified of the place. So I said, why are they scared of the place? He said, because it's clean and nobody cleans it, but the whole place is clean. So people are just scared, like it's a spiritual place, something's going on. I said, interesting. And then he said, and then also they say that the spiders came up and they wove a web over the grave so that nothing can fall on it. Okay, so that was interesting to me because, as you may know, in the history of Mariam, in Gedla Mariam, when Saint Mary and Joseph and Christ flee the soldiers of King Herod, it's said that they go into a cave in southern Egypt and the spiders come up and they weave a web over the cave so that the soldiers say nobody has been here for a long time, and they go away. So I said, now that's interesting again, the spiders. So then they say that. So then we get to the entrance of the place, and then these men come who are presumably the keepers of the place, and they said, the priest can come in, you can't come in. So I'm like, they say, women are not allowed in here. I was like, in Ethiopia was this? They said, I was like, am I in Ethiopia again? I thought it felt like I'm in Debre Damo or something, They said, women cannot enter this place. So I said, but a woman is buried there. I said, what do you mean women can't enter? And they said that Negista Saba, that Queen Saba came to them in a dream and said she doesn't want menstrual blood on her grave. So women cannot enter into the place. So immediately I called Abuna Saurios in Addis Ababa. And I told him, I was like, how about touching? He said, they were interested to come and see it. Yeah. So that's my experience of that place. It's a mystery. We don't know. So many things to discover in Africa, so many things to examine. You know, no one's digging outside of the Nile Valley. People need to, you know, there need to be archaeological digs in these places.
There's also a question, Rahel, about that was asked much earlier, having to do with the Rastafari movement. Long promoted the value of both the Tawahedo Ethiopian Orthodox faith and the African origins involvement of in Christianity to Africans in the West. Rastafari has also promoted Ethiopia and Ethiopianism across the world. Some Rastafari followers also joined the Tawahedo Church. As we proceed into the 21st century, what types of collaborations are possible to reconcile the innate perspectives shared by Rastafari practitioners and the researched perspective you're sharing?
Who asked that question, please?
Ross Wayne Rose.
Ross Wayne Rose. Aha, Professor Ross Wayne Rose. Hold on, I have to, it's gonna get a little dark here. I hope you can still see me. I might have to plug my computer in.
You're still, we can still see you.
Okay. Well, Professor Rose, first of all, let me say that, you know, as I said a little bit, the missionary, you know, Ethiopia Tawahedo Beta Christian had a couple of sort of missionary heights. One of them at the very, you know, early phase of the church, from like the 1st century, you know, up until the advent of Muhammad, and the Arab conquest of the empire. You know, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church spread as far west as Mauritania, as far south as Sudan, Somalia. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has had periods of great missionary periods where it has spread the faith. And then, you know, because of the colonization of Africa, and Arab conquest or Islamic conquest of Africa, the church became very inward looking, very conservative, very concerned with just preserving itself and preserving whatever knowledge it had. And that was the position of Tawahedo Beta Christian until the Rastafarian movement, in my estimation, until the Rastafarian movement started to really create a global awareness of Ethiopia, and of Emperor Haile Selassie, and then also through that awareness, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And as I mentioned, the first church in Europe was established with the support, financial and spiritual, of the Jamaican community in London, which established Zion Mariam Church. The first Ethiopian Orthodox Church in the United States, which was established in the Bronx, in New York, the Selassie Church, was also established largely with the support of the Jamaican community in New York. And these were Rastafarians. Both communities, the one in London and the one in New York, they were both Rastafarian communities. And they wrote letters to Emperor Haile Selassie and begged him to send them a priest. This was before large numbers of Ethiopians were coming to the West after the Red Terror. And so there were only few Ethiopians in America and few in Europe at that time, during the reign of Emperor Haile Selassie. And it was during that time that the Rastafarian community established these two churches, with the support of a very small number of Ethiopians that were in each place. And then these priests came and began teaching these Rastafarian communities Tawahedo Christianity, and people started to convert. And then with the Red Terror, when masses of Ethiopians began to leave Ethiopia, they then also joined these churches in New York and in London. The relationship between Tawahedo Beta Christian and the Rastafarian community is a relationship of love that continues. I don't think there's ever been a time since then where they have ceased to work together. I think that, you know, there are some problematic issues between Tawahedo Beta Christian and Rastafarianism on the use of marijuana. Although we do not have any canonical we don't have any canon that says that marijuana is sinful or anything like that. Marijuana is considered a medicine in the ancient Tawahedo Beta Christian, a medicine that needs to be used with circumspection. It's considered a very strong medicine within Ethiopian culture that's used for specific ailments. So I think that, you know, in terms of the orientation of Rastafarianism, the historiographical critique of Rastafarianism goes hand in hand with the Ethiopia Tawahedo Beta Christian tradition. The way that Rastafarianism champions African institutions and the authority of African institutions is very, very important. I think that the most, you know, as Bob Marley so rightly said, you know, that the most dangerous form of slavery is mental slavery. And so I admire the Rastafarian tradition and the constant critique that it gives of historiographical critique that it gives of history in general. And I think it's very valuable. And I think that Rastafarians can also learn from Tawahedo Beta Christian in that we have institutions and traditions that are independent of the West. So we need not always be reacting, if you will. We need not be always reacting to the struggle for justice or reacting to Eurocentric models in our identity. That we have an African identity that is there for us, that is independent of the experience of enslavement.
That actually leads right into the next question, Dr. Rachel. This one's from Yafet Girmay. Thanks, Dr. Rachel Leslie, amazing work. I grew up in the Eritrean and Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. And one of the things that I've noticed in the churches are the holy pictures of Jesus, Mary, the disciples, etc., went from being reflections of ourselves to images of white Western Christianity images. Is that something you noticed or are curious about?
Oh, Windeme. This is one of my main issues. You know, this is one of my main issues. And that's why, you know, this picture on the cover of the book, let me start there. This picture on the cover of the book is the oldest extant picture of Christ and the apostles. Okay, it's from the early 2nd century. And many people ask me, why didn't you put an Ethiopian icon on the cover of your book? Why did you put an Egyptian one, right? Now, I did this for us because I know in Ethiopia, a lot of people think our icons are just painted to look like Ethiopians because we like ourselves. And there is a certain detachment. A lot of people don't really believe that's what Christ and the Holy Family actually looked like. They believe that they look like Ashkenazi Jews. And those of you that don't know what Ashkenazi Jews are Jews from Europe. Many of whom converted to Judaism in the first millennia. And I've talked to a lot of rabbis about this, and you know, it's known. You know, Ashkenazi Jews know that many of them converted to Judaism. So there is a loss of knowledge because of the way in which Ethiopian education was formulated from the time of Menelik, when Menelik invited the British and these others to come in and set up the educational system in Ethiopia. With that came into Ethiopia all of these Eurocentric models of history, which made people in Ethiopia start to doubt their own institutions. Now, Queen Victoria was a very, very shrewd woman. Now, the thing is that when Queen Victoria gave the picture of the white Mary and Christ to Menelik, and Menelik, you know, wanting to be gracious, put it in his church. What I'm told from the bishops, then all Ethiopians wanted to have a similar picture like the king. So now I do not believe, knowing Queen Victoria and the phenomenal colonial power that she was, I don't think that she did that without intention. I think that there was some intention in introducing the white image of Christ into Ethiopia. We know from other colonial efforts in Africa that colonialists would say that Africans are so, religious, and they're so pious, and they're so into God. The way to conquer them is to send priests, And so I think that Queen Victoria, having learned from Africa, believed that to undermine the institutions in Ethiopia, which is a key aspect of colonialism. A key aspect of colonialism is to undermine all of the indigenous institutions and their authority. So I think this was part of a typical sort of Victorian effort to infiltrate the minds of Ethiopians. And it has gone so far that Abuna Paulos, when I was there, when I went there, I remember I went to the church in Addis Ababa, and I was so surprised to see all of these Dutch images of Christos with blonde hair and blue eyes. And I was like, what's going on? So one time when I was with Abuna Paulos, I asked him, I was so shocked. I was like, Abuna Paulos, what's going on with all these Dutch paintings? I mean, I don't even see any blonde and blue-eyed people in Israel today to speak of, unless they come from Germany or Russia. And I was like, what's going on? And then Abuna Paulo said, wait again. He said, I tried to put our icons in the church, and the people start shouting, they want this one back. He said they don't want the ancient icon. They want the blonde one. So, I agree with you that it's important that people on many levels, even independently of colonialism and mental slavery and all these things, people should be able to worship God in their own tradition, in their own image. And so it's problematic when people cannot see themselves as divine.
Well, that was all of your points are so profound. We could end on any of them, or we could go on forever with many of them, most of them. And unfortunately, we are at the end of our program. We thank you all for your wonderful contributions, your questions, your attention, and interest in this very, very important topic. And to our guest, Dr. Ts'gye Rachel Leslie, thank you so much for your work and your presentation today. I think, of course, Ato Fantahunt Urone and Dr. Ephraim Isaac, we appreciate your contributions today and your work as well. And Dr. Leslie, we just want you to keep on. We know it's not easy out there. We know as a person of color, as a woman in the world that you're in, you are inevitably facing pushback from people who are the gatekeepers. But we want to make sure that you know that, you're fighting on our behalf, and we appreciate it.
Thank you, my sister. Thank you. You honor me, and I feel very honored and very grateful that you arranged this for me and gave me this opportunity to be heard.
And I think if the audience can show their appreciation and continued interest by making sure they get copies of this book for themselves and for others. It is in English. It is, I don't know if you're intending to write an Amharic version down the road, but this book is available on the sankofa.com website. And we really encourage you to make sure that you get a copy to support our sister's work. We're going to roll out with a very wonderful presentation of Dr. Leslie playing the bagana.
Thank you so much
again.
Majamrio is always salamta. Let me just say. Salamta is say, Besma women first gedus ahadu amlak amen. And akmatin ingamendane yikere kagehanem kagefulu maate atalen adenenenji kamote yuchen menges yemenyakenya tivite gatenetin kahalinetin kebreme nate una yanze genzebu chorune le alemen Amen. Amen.
Wow, bro.